And
well, when I wrote this chapter, which is my favorite chapter in both books, it's try to make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. And so it's this sort of step behind, well, order your room first so that it's just not cluttered and idiotic and running at counter purposes to whatever your purposes are, a reflection of your internal chaos. Get it orderly, but that's not good enough. The next thing is see if you can make a relationship with beauty, which is really, it's really, people are afraid of that, because I've watched people try to buy art and they're terrified of buying art. And the reason is because their choice puts their taste on display. And if their taste is undeveloped, then their inability to distinguish between a false appearance and the genuine reality of beauty is immediately revealed to people. So they're terrified of it, but they're also equally terrified of beauty. So let me tell you a story about this, if you don't mind. I bought some Russian Impressionist paintings for my father. And I liked them a lot. This particular artist, the Russian Impressionist style is like the French Impressionist style, except it's a lot rougher. The brushstrokes are thicker, and so it's lower resolution, but it's equally beautiful in terms of palette. And I have a variety of paintings. If you get some distance from them, they just snap into representation. So lovely. And so I sent my dad like 8 of these paintings. And my mom took one look at them and she said, those are not coming out of the basement. And my mom is a conservative person. So she's not high in openness. She's not that interested in ideas. And and her aesthetic sense isn't sophisticated. Now, my mother has a lot of lovely attributes, and my dad and her differ in that. And so he loved these paintings, and then he made these frames for them. And then he brought one up, and my mom tolerated that. And then he brought another one up, and then she tolerated that. And then like all 8 of them eventually made it upstairs. And then a few years later, I was there, and she told me how much she loved the paintings. But they really set her off. And I think it was partly because, well, if imagine you're comfortable in your canonical perceptions of objects in some sense, and then the Impressionists come along and say, you could look at that whole landscape as if it was nothing but the interplay of color. And we forget how radical that is. I mean, those paintings caused riots in Paris when they were first showed, Impressionist paintings. And that's what my mother was reacting to. It's like, oh my God, there's a whole different way of looking at the world. I don't want to see that. And it's an invitation to that which is beyond the triviality of your perceptions, let's say. But it's to think that there's nothing about that that's worth being frightened of or challenging. You don't understand conservatives if you don't see that. So,
but in terms of beauty, one of the things that especially now one of the problems or the way that beauty can kind of overwhelm us is that we feel as if we give ourselves, we're afraid of the suspicion, the hermeneutics of suspicion. We're afraid that if we see reality discloses itself to us and we can see the connection between that which is appearing to me and something behind it, then I'm afraid that if I make that leap, then I'll be betrayed, or that it will
that it won't turn out to be real, and
sometimes it's not. Like it is possible to be tricked by appearances.
And this gets you to Hans, Saving Beauty. His critique of what you see going on right now is he argues, if you read ancient texts, if you read Plotinus, one of the features they'll say about beauty is it's striking and disturbing and disrupting. Right? And I want to come back to that about the transformative aspect of truth, but right, the transformative theory of truth. And Han talks about what we've done, right? And he talks about it in other books too, is we try to reduce the beautiful to the smooth, which is the ease at which we can consume something.
Yeah, like the smooth outer cover of a car.
Exactly.
Right, 1 pixel resolution.
Yes. And because what that does is it gives you, and I'll use this word deliberately, the veneer of beauty, but while protecting you from the hermeneutics of suspicion.
Smart. Yeah.
Right? You see that? So what we do is, and then he says, and pornography is the primary example of that, because what you do is you remove all threat, all mystery, all otherness from the person. So there's no way they can strike you or disturb you. There's no way
reject you.
Right. Yes, exactly. And so pornography is an example of the smooth completely overtaking the beautiful and being misunderstood as the beautiful. But if you gentlemen are in agreement with that, what that means, that's my answer to why the primacy of beauty. Because if you do not get that ability to, and I want to use this word in two sentences.
Sorry, please go ahead. Then I'll ask.
Yeah. I want to say through the way I'm saying, like through my glasses, beyond and by means of, if we can't properly get a moment where we can see through appearance into reality, we are locked into solipsism and skepticism. Mm-hmm. You need a primary, and if you do it rather than it is called to you, then you are trapped, right? You need something that calls you from beyond appearances so that you can properly align appearances to reality and you realize that's why the primacy of beauty. So
is that the ontological calling you out of epistemology? I
would argue that that's Plato's argument for how the beauty.
So when you say, so I've thought a lot about the relationship between love and truth, and I think love is primary and the truth is the handmaiden of love in some sense. But so there's a primacy there. I would say the primacy of love, but you're making an argument for the primacy of beauty. And so are they contradictory arguments?
No, not at all, because Plato's view of love, and you have to be careful because Plato is taking the Greek notion of eros and he's trying to bend it. And I think he's trying to bend it towards what the Christians are going to eventually talk about in agape.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So take that as a caveat on what I'm saying. But nevertheless, what's going on, right, is Plato says, no. What love is that you are called to beauty. And let me just try and show you. Give me a sec because there's a connection.
Yeah.
Okay. So this will sound like, where's he out of left field, but like truth, rationality. Most of the cognitive biases, in fact, there's a growing argument that a lot of the cognitive biases, confirmation bias, blah, 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 a lot of them are actually aspects of the my side bias. Egocentrism. I won't make that argument here. I think it's a good argument. But let's say, even if it's only partially true, this is an important point. And Spinoza got this, right? This orientation, self-relevance, how things are relevant to me, right? That sort of fundamental egocentrism, a fundamental way in which you're prioritizing your perception on the world, right? You can't reason your way out of that. Spinoza, the most logical of the philosophers, says, no. The only thing that will invert the arrow of relevance is love. This is Murdoch's point. Love is when you recognize something other than yourself as real.
Right. Okay, so let me ask you about that, because I've been thinking about the idea of being selfish.
Yes.
Psychopaths are selfish, but they also betray themselves.
Yes.
Because psychopaths don't learn from experience, and they doom their future selves. Yes. And so I kind of wonder if the love that lifts you out of this self-orientation, what it does in some sense is that it's the way you see the world. If you see beyond this narrow selfishness, because I don't really think there's any difference technically in me taking care of the multitude of future selves that I will become and me treating you properly.
I totally agree.
Okay,
I think
fine.
Your relationship to your future self is ultimately an agapic relationship. And I think that's the only way you can deal with a lot of the empirical research.
Okay. So you do.
Yeah, yes.
Why the empirical research?
Because I think the empirical research shows that, I mentioned it in the Cambridge talk that I sent you the link to, right? What if you do this? This is one instance among many experiments. You go into a bunch of academics at a university, the people who are supposed to be the best at taking data and processing it. You present them with all the evidence that they should start saving for their retirement right now.
Right.
And they won't do it. You come back 6 months later, you ask them at the time, is this argument a solid argument? Great evidence.
Yeah.
Come back 6 months. Have they changed? Not at all.
Yeah. The behavioral therapists know that perfectly well.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you do the following, you say, I want you to imagine your future self as a family member that you love and care about.
Right. They
will start to save, and more importantly, the vividness of that imagery predicts how well.
Well, that's so cool. Look, this program that we worked on, future authoring program.
Yes.
Well, it's predicated on the idea of developing a love for your future self. So it's an exercise. It's a real sense. It's like here, and it's the ethic that's underneath it, although this wasn't particularly conscious in my mind when I built it, was knock and the door will open. It's like, okay, let's play a game. you get to have what you want and need. But the rule is, first of all, you have to accept it. And second of all, you have to specify it. And so, but let's just play it as a game.
Yeah.
If you could envision a future that would justify your suffering, that's a really good way of thinking about it. Justify your suffering. What would that entail? And then I make it practical. It's like, well, what do you want for an intimate relationship? How do you want to treat your family members? What sort of job or career? Like I break it into 7 practicalities, to nail it down to the ground. And I do believe that, see, one of the things we found, we thought, well, what predicts whether or not this works? Because it really works. We dropped the dropout rate of young men at Mohawk College, 50%.
It should. It should.
Well, it did.
Yes.
And it had the biggest effect on those who were doing the worst, which is not very common for psychological interventions. But the only thing we could find content-wise that predicted how well it would work was number of words written. And so my sense was, well, that just was an index, a rough index of how much thought they put into it and how vividly, and then it would be, did they treat their future self with some love, like genuinely? And then did they differentiate that so it wasn't just an abstract mountaintop conceptualization? So,
but let's add one wrinkle that brings the beauty thing back. Because you go back and ask them, why didn't you pay attention to your future self?
Before. Well, sometimes people don't think they could. They have no idea that that's even a possibility.
That's, I don't deny that.
Yeah.
But overwhelmingly, people said, I don't want to look at that person because that's me, old and ugly.
They're afraid of it.
Yeah. And it's an aesthetic judgment. It's an aesthetic judgment. Right. And what you have to do is get them to reform it. But what if that's an old...
It's a shallow aesthetic judgment.
Yes. That's...
right.
Exactly.
My wife, she does portraits. And one of the things that's really interesting about my wife's art is she will look at, she's like Goya, although, Goya is Goya, obviously. But one of the things I really found striking about Tammy is she did a very detailed picture of my daughter's surgical wound. And that's not an easy thing to look at, right? Because you don't want to look at that. But that also ties in with the ideas we've been discussing about the fact that, so in the story of Exodus, when God tells Moses how to stop the Israelites from being bitten by poisonous snakes, he insists that they have to look at what's poisoning them. And, well, I think that's the crucifixion message,
it's the mystery of the crucifixion.
You bet, right.
All these images that we have, like the beauty of Christ's wounds, all these things which sound so completely
pathological.
To many people, if you can understand them properly, you can understand that
you have to gaze on that which most threatens you.
Yeah, there's a verse,
and then you say, well, this inadequacy of vulnerability that characterizes old age, there's a terror in that.
Yeah,
and so people won't go there.
Right, but what you do is you replace the shallow aesthetic. Right. Don't let the appearances distract you.
Right.
Let the appearances disclose. What if that was an old family member who's always look through and see that those appearances that's somebody who's been there, right? That you care about.
Someone you love.
Exactly. And so you beautify them, so you love them, and the love and the beauty, they reinforce each other. So for me, to answer your question, right, you're saying the primacy of love, and I think you ultimately mean agapic love, right? That and beauty, if you're incapable of turning the arrow of relevance and saying, I want that to exist rather than I want that to exist for me, right? That's what beauty does. And that's also the central move, I would argue, in love.